Welcome back to Professor Sky's recorded lectures of FCE 207, Haiti, the most important country in the world. As I like to say in the beginning of every episode, uh, YouTube learning is passive learning. University learning is active. So you're not going to get an actual class here. I'm not going to be assessing your work, but you can feel free to keep up with the homework, which I will give you at the end of the unit, so to speak. It is a 200 level class, so just keep that in mind. It's mostly for freshmen. And also, I do not consider myself, nor am I, an expert in Haiti. I consider myself to be an expert in communicating information in an engaging and meaningful way, if I could be so bold. But I certainly am not an expert on Haiti. So if you are, and you happen to stumble across this video and you want to make any precisions or comments, I'll try to pin them or I'll respond to them. I'll really appreciate it. Okay, so last time we talked about the French Revolution. And I was a little bit uncomfortable putting that up on YouTube because it's not about Haiti, but as we'll see, it is really connected, especially because of the philosophical currents that underpinned both revolutions. So let's get to my PowerPoint and I will show you what I do when I teach this class, which I'm going to be teaching tomorrow. This is going to be kind of like a dry run for me for when I teach this. Yes, continue to share. All men are equal, but the sugar must flow. These are my sources, by the way. Most of it's based on the Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan, but I use a lot of the same sources I'm sure he used, like Black Jacobins. In particular, I'm referencing a lot Avengers of the New World by Laurent Dubois, who also wrote The Aftershocks of History, a very good account of the revolution. Okay, let's move on. Students and friends, I am Professor Sky. My name is perhaps known to you. I have undertaken to teach about Haiti. I want curiosity and a thirst for complex understanding to reign in this class. I am working to help that happen. Unite yourselves, students, and learn with me for the same cause. This is what I want my students' notebooks to look like. I want them to write the word cognitive dissonance nice and big across the paper. And I'm going to give them the example that the person who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," Patrick Henry, owned people. Okay, that he was a slave owner. Okay, so like that's what's called cognitive dissonance, the mental phenomenon in which people unknowingly hold fundamentally conflicting thoughts. You believe people should be free, and also you believe that you can own people. That's what a lot of these things are talking about. And I'm going to put forth to my students and to you that there's only so much cognitive dissonance that can be supported at any one time by any person until they crack, and by any society until they crack. And I would say that a lot of these revolutions are just a result of too much cognitive dissonance building up. Okay. Little review of the French Revolution, not much, especially not here on YouTube. And then we'll talk about the Enlightenment and how revolutionary thoughts come to Haiti, or as it was called at the time, Saint-Domingue. That's Saint-Domingue, if you're trying to spell it in English. So this was a little review. I'm going to ask my students what were the three estates of the ancient regime? How did the revolution disrupt this order? It completely destroyed it. There was the third estate, which was the vast majority of people. There was the first estate, which was the clergy. That means the church. The second estate, which was the nobility. And the church and the nobility had all the power. And after the revolution, that changed, and there was no longer a king, and it was a big whole thing. Watch the last episode about that. And we have the whole king with his head cut off. And I want to just remind everybody of this little device I came up with. French philosophy inspired the American Revolution, which partly caused and partly inspired the French Revolution, which partly caused and partly inspired the Haitian Revolution. These things are all connected, and they're all connected by this sense of an enlightenment. I thought there was an enlightenment. I included this quote, which, if you haven't seen the last episode or the last class, please pause this frame and read it entirely because this is Montesquieu writing from a very satirical point. By the way, I'm going to be using terms which are not politically correct now. They're not considered to be proper nomenclature. Terms like white, black, colored. You may even see slaves used instead of enslaved people. Our language has evolved. We now speak more accurately and more compassionately than we did before, but the historical documents are what they are, and scholarship is what it is. And we had not made that change until very recently. Anyways, please read this. It's a very beautiful piece of work, satire, irony. He does not believe the things that he's saying. He is trying to point out the cognitive dissonance where people held two things at once, and then he hits with this. It is impossible for us to suppose these creatures, that is to say, enslaved people, these creatures to be men because allowing, whoops, what the, hey, because, hey, because allowing them to be men, a suspicion would follow that we ourselves are not Christians, meaning you cannot be Christian and support slavery at the same time. Amazing mic drop moment. Although C.L.R. James, I want to make sure you have an idea of what he looks like. He's the great, probably the greatest Haitian scholar of all time with his book, The Black Jacobins, really helped to usher in a new way of thinking about how to do history and also how to talk about Haiti. Two very important things, certainly for this class. He said that wordy attacks against slavery drew sneers from observers, which were not altogether undeserved. The authors were compared to doctors who offered to a patient nothing more than invectives against the disease which consumed him. All right? Not yet. So the point that I'm making about this, and that I made in the last class, is that this is true, that these were just words, 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 words. But they were words which were part of a philosophy which I do believe did have a direct role in these revolutions. So even though Diderot or Rousseau or Montesquieu talking about how slavery is bad is not the same thing as actually solving it, it was a part of a current of thought which would help to lead to the ultimate ending of feudalism and the slave trade. But of course, most 99.9% of the work was done by people who were not trained, who were not educated in European universities, who were not aware of the Enlightenment. Okay. Today's episode is brought to you. No, it's not. It's not brought to you by Dunkin'. I am from Boston, but I'm not sponsored by Dunkin' Donuts. But this is just a little fun aside. I might even take this out for my class. This might be just for you on YouTube. But this was a thought that I had and I realized, and it's just funny. It's just funny. History is funny. And if we don't recognize the funny stuff, I don't know. It's a weird thing. It's a very weird thing. Because the same way that you had this whole idea of like the French philosophy leading to American Revolution, leading to French Revolution, leading to Haitian Revolution. America runs on Duncan. But the revolutions run on enlightenment. Like the idea that you need to have equality and that people are born equal, that's actually based on the concept of enlightenment. The reason that I bring in this crass commercialism, okay, I do not think you should go to Dunkin' Donuts. There's better places to get coffee. Okay, that's my that's my suggestion. But enlightenment, if you look at it, was actually run on coffee. There would not have been, realistically, the Enlightenment might not have ever happened if it were not for coffee. And that's not just me being cute. All right, here's a little bit of evidence. A recently written scholarship here by was it Kyle Gibbs. I can't really see my own slides here because my setup isn't very good. Please read the name of the scholar who said this. The cafe spurred on the revolution, essentially because as it served as a base for the exchange of ideas. All right, so think about that. Think about the fact that cafes are places where people could get together and talk and foment revolution. In some ways, the reason that there may never be another successful revolution in our world is because most of our revolutionary thoughts happen in places that can be easily surveilled and infiltrated, which is to say, the internet. It's hard to make a revolution if you're not in the same place as the people with whom you're going to make a revolution. Okay, so the cafe is where it was happening. Coffee, entertainment, and other things offered. There were aids to conversation in various ways, but were at best secondary to what was important to Parisians of the day: information. Coffee houses were central locations for the interchanges amongst intellectuals that constituted much of the structure of the Enlightenment. Why coffee houses? In part because the consumption of coffee promoted the sobriety appropriate for the discussion of important subjects. Why not bars? People get together in bars because, man, when you get drunk, you might fight with each other, but you're not going to take down the government. You're pacified. When you're drunk, you're slower. when you're hyped up on coffee and you're surrounded by other people, yeah, 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 people born free, people born free. Yeah, one more thing, like it seems like they're born free, but everyone like they put themselves in chains, man. Oh my God, man, right? Like that's what happens. You get all jacked up. Patrons of the cafe, quote, did not just read silently or listen passively to gazettes. Read aloud. They discussed, weighed, assessed, criticized, and formed opinions about their contents. Now, why am I spending so much time to talk about this? Because let's not get it twisted. If the Enlightenment, especially the Enlightenment in France, was the biggest spiritual force behind all these revolutions, where did the coffee come from? The coffee came from Saint-Domingue. Half of the world's coffee production came from Saint-Domingue. And certainly France, with its exclusive, where they got all of the imports from Saint-Domingue, they'd be just drinking French coffee. They'd be drinking Haitian coffee or Saint-Dominguean coffee, Dominican coffee. I don't know. I mean, coffee initially comes from Yemen and Ethiopia. It comes from Africa, but it was able to be cultivated quite easily in Haiti, as we know. So it's an interesting idea, the cyclical nature that the people who were enslaved to be forced to serve the coffee and maybe even the sugar that went along, that those people, through a series of events, would ultimately find the kind of liberation that was preached about, that was aided by the caffeine and the coffee and the cafes that were able to be afforded by their labor. It's like a big circle. Is that a good point? You tell me. I'm teaching my class soon. You tell me if I should keep that in. I think it's interesting. But maybe the coffee came to a place like Bordeaux. Okay, Bordeaux is a beautiful place in France. I spent a week there. I was there with like this woman who I didn't really know that well. We spent a week together as like platonic friends. Kind of at the end, I was like, maybe more. She was like, nah. I was like, yeah, yeah. Anyways, I hear she's happily married now. Good for her. So, Port of Bordeaux, beautiful city, one of the most beautiful places yeah, I've ever been. Again, the only problem with the Port of Bordeaux is, as you know, it's completely covered in blood, and so you're just slipping all over the place. But let's talk about the Port of Bordeaux as an example of what was happening in France. Can you spot one of our characters from this class? Can you see? Can you see one of the whites? It's white, X, Y, Z. It's white Y, I believe. You ready? There he is. Peekaboo. Where's Waldo? There he is. Guess we'll call him Waldo now. All right. Why did I talk about him? Well, he's an important symbolic figure. Do you remember? You can actually see who he works for. Who he works for is down there. We're not going to give him a funny name. We're just going to call him Mr. Maritime Bourgeoisie. Maritime means pertaining to the oceans and seas. Okay, boats and stuff. Bourgeoisie means that he is in the third estate, but he is well off. He is financially successful. Many, if not most of the bourgeoisie, no, many of the bourgeoisie were much more affluent than many of the aristocrats in the Ancien regime. Because just because you have land doesn't mean you have money. So he is an example of a super rich, fancy, maritime bourgeoisie guy. And this is where we get to the central conflict. This is where we get to some of that beautiful cognitive dissonance. This is quoted by C.L.R. James, and it's a quote of Juarez. The slave trade and slavery formed the economic basis of the French Revolution. The sad irony of human history, comments Juarez. The fortunes created at Bordeaux, at Nantes by the slave trade gave the bourgeoisie that pride which needed liberty and contributed to human emancipation. So many of the people, as you heard in the podcast, if you did the homework for today, as you heard in the podcast, 150 of the members of the National Assembly had direct ties to the slave trade. So part of the reason they felt pride and like they could do it and they had meaning and they weren't just subjects, they could be citizens, was because of how prosperous they were in denying the humanity of other people. Oh, yeah, there's Mr. Maritime Bourgeoisie. I'll tell you his story a little bit. Son of a cloth salesman, he grew up poor, but now he runs a bank in Bordeaux. That bank funds slave ships. Would you like to guess what bank it is? That's right. It's the same bank that repossessed many plantations in Saint-Domingue because half of the slave owners were in France, half of the plantation owners were in France. That's right. His bank is the one that bought the bank that bought the plantation of Small White Y. Bourgeois White Z, son of a prosperous Bordeaux merchant, works as a lawyer for a Bordeaux bank. So we have kind of some of our different kinds of people together. Now, this Mr. Maritime Bourgeoisie, he goes to the Estates General, which you learned about in the last semester, in the last class, which, if you don't remember, that's when Louis the 16th said, I don't know what to do, so let's all just get together and see if we can figure it out. And that would end up leading to the French Revolution, where the third estate, which is to say the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the working class, everybody who is not a noble or a clergy member, would demand for a revolution and have a revolution. So that's Mr. Maritime Bourgeoisie is there. He becomes a member of the National Assembly. He becomes a montagnard. When the king gets his head chopped off, he's all cheering. He is a revolutionary for freedom. All day, every day, all he thinks about is freedom and the need for freedom and how humans are born equal. Cognitive dissonance. Okay? That's what this is. People need to be free. I know because I got a great education and I have access to books and I'm super rich because of not letting people be free. So I have a little creek in my backyard and there are strange children running around in it. It's a little disconcerting. So today's class is largely based up on these three clubs. So I joke around with the term reason will prevail, from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. But like this is the Enlightenment, and this is where people are feeling like they need reason to prevail. So what I want to do is I want to focus on these clubs as like examples of people trying to coordinate, meet together, presumably drink a lot of coffee, get together, coordinate, and figure out how to make the changes that they need to make. How during the revolution can the three separate groups that exist, how can they be heard and be felt? Again, these three groups, as they are described in the historical texts, are the blacks, the whites, and the coloreds, which is to say, the enslaved people, the the people of European descent who control most of everything, and then coloreds are a mixture of white and black who often have a lot of power, but still suffer from increasing amounts of systemic racism. Okay. Actually, systematic racism. It's not just systemic, it's systematic. It's all intentional. Okay. So let's talk about these three clubs that are formed. So there is a disagreement between some of these whites. So Big White X, who's hanging out over there in Saint-Domingue, who's making all this money hand over fist and sending all this sugar. The sugar must flow. The sugar must flow. The sugar must flow. It is absolutely necessary for the French government and for the people. And French maritime bourgeoisie, he's happy to cash those checks. But what is their disagreement? Well, the disagreement is the exclusive, which, if you remember from a couple classes ago, means that the French government receives all imports and Saint-Domingue takes all exports from France, which is a terrible position to be in if you are rich and a trader. You want to have a more beneficial trading deal. So this leads to the citizens of Saint-Domingue, especially the white enslavers, feeling as though they are being oppressed from France. Now, what did they agree on? Well, they agreed that it was a great idea to enslave black people. There was no disagreement about that. And they definitely agree that the sugar must flow. When I say that, I'm kind of doing a little Dune joke there because the slogan of Dune is the spice must flow, but it's an intentional one that Frank Herbert used. The most important thing for everybody in this, except for the enslaved people, the most important thing for them is that there is sugar because sugar is literally more valuable than gold. It is literally more valuable than gold. So their greed, their society, their structure, their well-being, their living, their family's future, everything depends on the sugar coming from Saint-Domingue and going to France. The sugar must flow. So the French Revolution for the whites of Saint-Domingue, it's interesting because, the French Revolution comes and they think Maybe we will finally be free. Now you might be sitting there, maybe saying, free from whom? Well, free from the royal governor, free from Louis the 16th, free to basically run Saint-Domingue the same way that American slave owners were able to run their plantations. Just they do what they want. They don't have to have some, they aren't locked into some kind of terrible agreement. They don't have to pay deference to someone else. So whites get together and they form in a little hotel, Club Massiac. Not you, not the small whites. At this point, the small whites aren't really in the picture. We're just talking about whites who own land. That's the most important thing on planet Earth at this point, that or at least in Europe, that you are a white person who owns land. You see Saint-Marie up there, the same guy who codified all the different skin tones. If you remember all that. I said he wasn't like a terrible monster, but I was being a little too nice to him. He's a pretty bad guy in this whole story because he is just working really hard for the big white planters. So they go to the Estates General, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, they are unified in the idea that they have to protect their privilege over another group in Haiti. Remember from two classes ago, the web of tension, the coloreds. The coloreds who have power, the coloreds who have money, the coloreds who have plantations. Now, what is the French Revolution for the coloreds of Saint-Domingue? Well, the first declaration, the Constitution, and the Constitution of the First French Republic is based on the acceptance of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. This is not something that someone came up with and they said, okay, oh, that's cool. No, it's right here. And not for nothing, but they're ripping off the Jefferson's Bill of Rights. So just so you know, like the interchange, Jefferson was inspired by Rousseau, and then the French are inspired by Jefferson for writing, all men are born equal. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. This is the first thing it says. This is the foundational concept of the French Republic. So the National Assembly all gets together and they scream, equality, freedom, freedom. All men are equal. All men are equal. You might be raising your hand saying, what about women and stuff? It's a whole nother question. When they say all men, they mean mostly property owning white people. Okay? Men, mostly property owning men. That's what they mean. But, anyways, this is not a feminist class. I mean, it is a feminist class. Everything I do is feminist, but that's not the focus of this class. Freedom, freedom, equality. All men are equal. All men are equality. Freedom. That's the National Assembly. I'll show you a little image. The National Assembly still exists. So I just kind of put up their little logo there. Whenever you see that, you know we're talking about the National Assembly, which, if you forget from last class, is the decision body that was created that is composed of half of the third estate and then a quarter first estate, clergy, a quarter second estate, nobility, which is going to lead to a great division because the nobility and the clergy tend to be more conservative, and the third estate tends to be more progressive, tends to be the right and left divisions all came about because the National Assembly was literally divided between left and right. And if you sat to the right of the president, you were the president's name of the person. They weren't like the leader of the country. They were the person who sat in front of the entire assembly and would hear everyone talk. That if you were to the right of the president, you were clergy or you were aristocrat. If you sat to the left, you were a member of the third estate, bourgeoisie, working class, etc. So in the National Assembly is where they're making all these decisions, where they're talking, where they're giving all these great speeches, where they're developing the Constitution, where they're figuring out all these decrees, because they don't quite know how to lead, because they've been just led by a king who's just Drax does everything all by himself. And all of a sudden they have to figure out how are you going to lead. The echo. There's going to be an echo there. Okay, there's going to be an echo there because the freed, enslaved people are going to have to figure out how to lead as well. So everyone is sitting there in the National Assembly. They're going crazy, man. They're all hopped up on coffee. They're just jazzed and they're just like, we gotta have freedom, freedom. Yeah, 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 totally, totally. And then Duc de Rochefoucauld comes up. It's like, yeah, 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 freedom, freedom. Let's end slavery. Chirp, chirp. No one says anything. Basically, whenever slavery is brought up, Everybody in the National Assembly pushes it away, says we'll decide on this later. This is not of primary importance. This is not the kind of freedom that we're worried about. We will decide on this later. And that will also apply to the rights of colored people as well. Absolute crickets. Now, why? Why is that the case? Because we still have a lot of people. We have over 150 members who have direct ties to the slave trade, and the government still needs the money. Why? Why do we accept this cognitive dissonance if all men are created equal and also we need slaves? Because the sugar must flow. All men are born and free and equal. But still, the colored citizens of Saint-Domingue hear this and they think maybe we will finally be free. Free from whom? Well, they have to be free from the whites and free from the metropole, from France, from the hexagon. That's a lot. They have a lot. So Raymond and Auger start the Society of American Colonists. I'm just going to define that for you a little bit more clearly. When they say American, they really just mean Saint-Domingue. This is not going up to any other colonies. And when it says colonists, it really means the colored colonists. That's who this is for. So just imagine it's called the Society of French Saint-Domingue Coloreds. That's what it actually is. Those are the interests who they're serving. But if you remember from a couple classes ago, there are increasingly large number of explicitly racist laws being passed in Saint-Domingue that's being done to intentionally create division and anger between the whites and the coloreds. Divide and conquer is the philosophy. Divide and conquer is the policy. And that's what they were trying to do. And so they keep passing more and more laws. You know, you can't take anyone's name. You have to have papers everywhere you go. You're not allowed to wear silk, all sorts of stuff like that. So they realized they needed representation. And during the revolution, they're like, okay, well, Raymond was already in Paris, so they're just going to work on this. They're going to work for their rights. Let's take as example, great hero of history, Julien Raymond. He was a wealthy, free, colored man of Saint-Domingue. He went to France to protest racism in 1885, way before the revolution. He had power, he had influence, but he understood that his people would never be free unless he went and fought for his rights. He even confronted the French colonial ministry, went right up there in Paris and said, you know, even though my skin may not be as light as yours, I deserve rights. All men are created equal. You know where this is going, right? You've been watching this class, you know where this is going. Quite ambiguous figures of history. He also owned a plantation, owned over 100 enslaved. I gotta change that. So, one second. I gotta, I gotta, one second. 100. Sorry, I gotta fix this when I can. And enslaved people. That's better. Okay. Oh wait, what am I? Am I sharing it now? What am I even doing right now? What am I even doing right now? Share. Okay, continue to share. Okay. So quite ambiguous figures of history for Julien Raymond, owned over 100 enslaved people, and he fought really hard to uphold slavery. This is why this class is partly based on the idea that there's no héros and there's no bandit. There's no heroes and there's no good guys. There's no good guys and no bad guys. Not really in history. I mean, there are worse guys, and we're going to be studying them. We've already seen them. Okay. Obviously, whatever Big White X has done is exponentially worse than whatever Julien Raymond has done. But still, it's important to remember that this is a very complex time where you have people working to fight racism while simultaneously trying to uphold slavery. We're going to come back to this moment, but in 1789, they go to the Club Massaic and say we should work together. And he says no. And I ask my students, why did Club Massaic reject Raymond's overture to join forces with the Free Club people in Paris? Because racism is why. They had to maintain it. They were just making a bet that if the colors got too much power, then it would eventually turn against them. But if they could continue to push down the coloreds and align themselves with the whites, the small whites and the poor whites would be easier to manipulate and would be an easier way to consolidate their power. I just want to take a second here to have some sympathy for these characters. even though they do a lot of unsympathetic things like have plantations. There's an expression in French called un cul entre deux chaises, which means an ass between two chairs. It traditionally applies to immigrants, recent immigrants, to any country where it's like they are in two different cultures, and so they can never be comfortable and like just in one seat. But it can also apply to like, I think it can apply to people who are multi-ethnic or multiracial, because like how you are treated by society can vary greatly depending on how people perceive you at the moment that they're looking at you. And the thing about the coloreds of Saint-Domingue is this is the question. Who are they? Well, many of them are rich landowners, and they are all non-white people. So the question is, what is the conjunction that goes in between them? Are they rich landowners and non-white people, which is what they are fighting for? Or are they rich landlord, or do they have to choose between being rich landowners or non-white people? Which is to say, is Saint-Domingue, is France going to decide which one they are? Do we divide the people of Saint-Domingue according to class or according to race? Because according to class, many of these coloreds belong with the whites. According to race, many of these coloreds belong with the blacks. This is the complexity. This is the fight. And meanwhile, all these small whites who moved to Haiti, and there's a lot that moved to Haiti right at the outbreak of the revolution, because if you remember, the French Revolution came right after a famine, or like during a famine, so people had to get out. And I don't know, I'll try going over there. The more the colors are put down, the more the small whites are lifted up. If it had been successful to fully push out the colors of any power, then most certainly their land and their property and their enslaved people would have been seized by small whites. That's just what would have happened. That's the only way to maintain this system. So the small whites were highly motivated to keep it this way because they knew they would be able to seize this power. Are small whites poor, landless people, or are they white? Because they are often both. And it's a question, do we divide them by class or by race? Which is why the real thing that actually threatens any powerful group, anyone in power, the main thing they need to fear is whenever people can get over these kinds of divisions. Because if everybody got together, anyways. So this made them realize they might need to arm themselves. They might need to fight this, right? They might need to fight this. They might need to go to war with the whites of the island. Now, were they the friends of the blacks? I'm going to ask my students this, and I'm really hoping the definitive answer that they give us is, well, of course not, because they wanted slavery. And it wasn't that they were trying to be white. It was that that was the way they perceived of having any amount of freedom and happiness and prosperity. That's just what they perceived. But there were people who fought on behalf of the enslaved people, the Society of the Friends of the Blacks. People like Robespierre and Mirabeau. Okay, we'll be talking about some of these people now. I'm not going to make you memorize all their names. You do have to know. Well, I'm sorry, I'm talking to you, YouTube, like you're my class. My class has to know the names of these three clubs and roughly what they did, because this is people trying to walk it like they talk it. If you believe all people are free, then hey, you need to free all people. That's a fairly simple equation. It was a Parisian society, so that means it was not in Saint-Domingue, started in 1788, against slavery, but also for free colored rights, which, as we see, doesn't go together. The coloreds who are fighting for freedom are not fighting for an end to slavery. We need to stop thinking in black and white terms. Yesterday's class, my 3-year-old was having a hard time having a nap downstairs, and I had to go take care of her. That's my 1-year-old. My wife's with her entirely. So if you hear crying, it is a child who is entirely cared for. Oh, remember this? Remember the tennis court oath? Remember how I was telling you? Like it was this huge moment where after calling the Estates General, All the people who came realized they needed to band together and do something outside the parameters of the king. So they went to this tennis court at the Chateau de Versailles where the king lived, and they all got together and they vowed to work together as three estates to form a better place and fundamentally a union. Do you see? Do you see big white X here? I'll give you a second to look. Okay, it's one of those Where's Waldo things. Do you see big white X? There he is. Put him in there. All right. Of course he was there because the Club Massiac was there. Because they knew if we're figuring out who's going to be representative, we need to. This was weird, actually. This was interesting. The people who controlled and had money in Saint-Domingue didn't know whether or not they should try to be a part of the revolutionary government. Because, like, if they went to be a part of the revolutionary government, then that would be continuing their allegiance to people who are controlling them. And if they just stayed aligned with the king, then maybe they could use that as a way to divide themselves from the newly formed Republican government by, being some kind of loyalist outpost or something. I don't know. I don't really know what they were thinking, but ultimately what they decided to do was to participate in the revolution and try to have a seat at the table. That's what they wanted. And they said, we deserve and have representation proportionate to the number of our inhabitants, right? That's how you do it. That's how you determine who represents. Well, that's one way to do it. And then Mirabeau comes up and he gives one of the great speeches ever. A member of the Society of the Friends of the Black, someone who's trying to walk it like he talks it, comes out and he says on the floor, you claim representation proportionate to the number of inhabitants. The free blacks are proprietors and taxpayers, and yet they have not been allowed to vote. And as for the enslaved people, either they are men or they are not. If the colonists consider them to be men, let them free them and make them electors and eligible for seats. If the contrary is the case, have we, in apportioning the deputies according to the population of France, taken into consideration the number of our horses and our mules? Right? Everyone was going crazy. This was a fascinating, it was a killer mic drop speech, and everyone went crazy. It's a good point. It's a really good point. Saying if they're, you can count them if we can count our mules because you treat them like mules. And if you don't think they're mules, then you have to treat them like people, in which case, of course, you can have more representations, but some of them are going to have to be formerly enslaved people who you just freed. This is that cognitive dissonance that's going to come in over the body because everyone, as Mike Duncan points out, is quite uncomfortable by this. No one is happy about this idea. This is not welcome. People don't talk about Bruno. Do not talk about the slave trade. Don't, because that's our cash cow. The sugar must flow. 150 of these deputies are going to be directly tied to the slave trade. So, no matter how great his speech was, much like CLR James tells us, he was just telling a patient. He was just telling a patient what the problem was, but not trying to fix it, even though he was trying. He was trying. They asked for 16, and they got six, two from each region. Sorry, my 3-year-old loves the count. Ah, ah, ah. So, who was represented? So, if Saint-Domingue had official representation in the National Assembly in France, right, in Paris, and the metropole, of these 9 people who I have representing different sides, who is going to be represented in these six? Is it going to be, two blacks, two coloreds, two whites? No, that's kind of silly, but like a small white and a bourgeois white. No, just the big whites. All six. Stacked court. Oh, sorry. Let's see if I have like something I can put my back pain. And already, it's worth mentioning, the big whites had already been meeting secretly on the island, excluding the coloreds and the small whites. They've been getting ready for this. They know this is their time to shine. This is the time where they are going to get their dream of being free of the exclusive, free trade, and autonomy. That's what they want. And had they succeeded, they would have been a wildly rich, it's just an amazingly rich, successful country for years to come. There's the issue, of course. The Society of the Friends of the Blacks were all white guys. right? But still, news of the revolution happens. You can't stop it from being heard. Even news of the Declaration of the Rights of Human, even the Human Rights Declaration, even though people tried to stop the newspapers from circulating, people tried to stop the enslaved people from hearing, they still heard about it. So they are also thinking, hey, we might be free. Remember how like 30 years ago, I was I was cutting, I was harvesting some coffee, and then that went over the sea. And then there are some people in a cafe who are taking the coffee that I made through the exploited labor, and they got together and had an idea that people should be free. And they went so far as to actually found their entire constitution based on the idea that people should be free. Well, maybe that means that I should be free. Maybe that means the whole world knows I should be free. Free from whom? All of them. All of them. All the forces are against them. They only have one thing in their favor, which is numbers. Oh, and they have some brilliant leaders too. We haven't met any of them yet, but they have numbers. And then things get really complicated. Things are coming to a head here. May 1790 in the National Assembly, citizens are people who own property. So this is a piece of good news for the colored inhabitants. It is some freedom for them, some rights. But at the same time, the colonists are granted their own assembly, which is called the colonial assembly. They put it in Saint Mark because it's as far away as it can be from Le Cap Français, which was like a hotbed. Um, so like all of the forces that were loyal to the king were one side, and all the forces who were like Republicans and in favor of this new republic and in favor of democracy were on the other side. So they were as far away from them as they could be because they didn't want to be a part of the French Republic or a part of the French monarchy. They just wanted to be able to sell sugar. So they start making some decisions. They just say, we don't care what the National Assembly says. They say they're going to have home rule. They say, no, it's going to be citizens for whites only. And you know what? No exclusive. We can trade with whoever we want. And this was too much. So both forces came in on them to try to get them to leave and to try to capture them and arrest them. But what happens? They get on a boat and they go. The name of the boat was called the Leopard, and they are known as the Leopardans, and they leave. The most strident pro slavery, pro big white stance. Now, importantly, they did not say big whites, they said whites. They did not say landowning whites. They said any white person who's lived on the island for more than a year and is over 25 years old gets to be a citizen, gets to have those rights. They have officially made their clear declaration. It is race, not class, which will determine how this island is run. And then they end up having to escape. They escape. And which club do they join? Of course, Club Massiac. So I talked about this, the Society of American Colonists. Let's go back to Vincent Auger. Mike Duncan pronounces it Auger. It's a name I've not really seen before. I would say Auger with being a French professor, but sometimes some names they're just pronounced ways I don't think they would be. So feel free to tell me in the comments. He's a great hero of history, wealthy, free, colored man in Saint-Domingue. He studied in Bordeaux. Remember how I tried to emphasize that colored Z studied in France? That's why I wanted you to understand like that really did happen quite a bit. And he fought against racism. You know what's coming. He also was a part owner of a plantation, worked in the coffee trade, fought to uphold slavery. Revolutions run on coffee. Once again, we go back to this moment in 1789 when they said we should work together. No. And we go back to 1790, and at this point, it is clear to the coloreds that Saint-Domingue would never accept what was declared in Paris. Citizens are people who own property. The writing is on the wall. It is going to be race. It is not going to be class. By October 1790, they are going to go so far as to say in the National Assembly that no law upon the status of persons shall ever be made for the colonies except on the precise and formal demand of the colonial assemblies. Meaning those guys who jumped on the boat, they are the kinds of people who should be deciding what happens, not people in France. They're abdicating their control, which means it's all going to go to the big whites. Let the colony figure it out. They realize they need to arm themselves. 1790, Auger shows up at the north, and he had a failed revolt. You heard about it on the podcast. It was a failed revolt. There's not that enough people. It was raining. It didn't work. He tried to flee, and then he got caught. But the thing is, what he was fighting for is what the French. Listen, I gotta stop the share here. What he was fighting for is what was promised from the French government. So they're not independent. They are a part of France. They are a French colony. The National Assembly, the ruling body, declared that coloreds are citizens. They have the rights. So they are just fighting for what was given to them, what was rightfully theirs. And he also said that they might work with the enslaved people. Don't don't say that. If you say that, people are going to absolutely lose their minds because again, they are outnumbered 10 to 1. 10 to 1 on this little island. And when I say they, I mean like, there's 10 to a half, right? Because it's the one that I'm talking about is half coloreds, half whites. That's how much they're outnumbered. But they're putting forth, hey, you want to say that we should have all the same rights as the blacks, then maybe we'll just work with the blacks. And for that, he was put on a wheel. He was tortured, by the big whites and by the small whites. They saw the danger that he was. So they cracked his back and tore all his body apart on the wheel and then cut off his head and kind of turned him into a martyr. The coloreds understood they really needed to arm themselves. They realized how unsafe they were. Do you see that just by saying that everybody is free, everywhere where people aren't free, everything gets tight, everything gets chaotic because that cognitive dissonance can't exist. There's only so long it can exist. Finally, the French Constitution of 1791, the one that's made up sort of after all these things is made. And Robespierre, the future leader of the terror, is going to come up and he's going to do a whole speech about why slavery is bad. And our old friend Raymond is going to come up and give a whole speech saying that coloreds need the rights to protect slavery. So they're going to make a constitution and everyone's going to be unhappy and everyone's going to read it differently and it's going to be a terrible answer. They remove the word slavery and replace it with unfree person. If all men are born free and equal, how can there be an unfree person? Cognitive dissonance. And then they just threw on that if your parents were free, then you're free. So you can't be a first generation. If both your parents were born free, then you can be free. Does that make sense? So, um, if your father was enslaved, if your mother was enslaved and your father was free and they had you, you're not a citizen. But if your grandfather was enslaved, right? Do you understand? So like that's what it could be. Now, this is only like 100 people that were made citizens by this, but still, this is telling both things to both people. So here's the National Assembly. This is a great compromise. We don't use the word slavery, so that's good. No one will be upset there. The whites will, be happy because, there's no threat to their slavery. And the colors will be happy because, they have some representation. And so what was the reality? The reality was everybody looked at the National Assembly and was unhappy. And the next class, we are going to have so many revolts. So many revolts. Homework for Wednesday is going to be listening to episode 4 of Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast and answering the questions. You don't get access to the questions. I'm sorry. They're just listening questions that I came up with. Also, I am including some reading from Avengers of the New World as well. I will try to put up those numbers in the description to this video if I remember to do that. All right, so there you go. There is the building tensions, the growing tensions, and the fact that you cannot square this circle. If people are free, then all people should be free. and you cannot be free if you are enslaved. Until next time, there's the camera.